The MiG-15, the Russian-built state-of-the-art jet fighter, light, simple, and inexpensive to produce. Its opponent, the pioneering American Sabre F-86, high-tech, heavy, and expensive to build. In 1950, the Korean War broke out. The 3-year aerial combat that followed was to be the first time swept-wing jet fighters came head-to-head. See how the MiG and the Sabre compare in the dogfights of the Korean War as they take to the air once again. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. Fearing the spread of communism, the Americans helped the UN support South Korea. Battle began on land as the Americans pushed the North Koreans back across the border. It was a fierce ground war. But by the end of the year, aerial combat became just as intense. American forces first faced the MiG-15 on the 8th of November, 1950. The introduction of this jet plane by the Chinese and Korean forces took everyone by surprise. The Russian-made MiG's prime directive was to shoot down U.S. fighter bombers that protected troops fighting in North Korea. The West knew little about the MiG, but reports soon came in about its devastating capabilities.
When MiG first came out, because it was faster than the American planes flying over North Korea at that time, such as F-80 Shooting Stars and the F-51 Mustangs. So at that time, MiG was the fastest plane in North Korea, so they were really proud of the MiG-15.
The MiG was one of the first jet fighters. The Russians began work on it in 1947. 1 year later, the MiG was ready to fly. Its design team, headed by Magoyan and Gurevich, created this state-of-the-art fighter.
They managed to build a unique plane, the quality requirements of which were very high for its time. The speed of the plane was meant to be greater than 1,000 kilometers per hour at ground level, and in the air at the height of 10,000 meters, it had to fly at more than 1,020 kilometers per hour. It was meant to climb to a height of 10,000 meters in about 3.2 minutes.
Speed was the key. The MiG was twice as fast as the propeller planes in the skies at the time.
It was a light airplane. It had beautiful operations in speed and climb in particular.
The first MiG was powered by the British-designed Nene jet engine. The British gave the Russians the design when they were allies just after the Second World War. The Nene was a centrifugal compressor engine. Air is sucked in through the front intake into the compressor. It then compresses the air using the centrifugal force. The compressed air is then pushed into the combustion chamber where kerosene is injected, ignited, and burnt to produce high-velocity exhaust gas, the jet thrust. By 1951, the Russians had modified the British design, creating the VK-1 engine. For the pilots, it was faster and more reliable.
The first MiG was actually very heavy. 2 hands were not strong enough to steer it. But when you put the boosters in the VK-1 engine, oh, well, then the plane flew like a dream in comparison to the previous model.
6 months into the war, the small, robust MiG-15, capable of flying at 670 miles per hour, was ready to rule the skies above Korea.
I felt no fear, but an immense sense of joy. As I took off, I felt I had a magic power in my hands, and I could bring the plane to the right position. So, that was my first flight. I will remember it all of my life.
The MiG appeared invincible. Its simple design allowed it to take a massive hit from the enemy and still fly.
In September 1952, one of the planes of the 64th Division was hit. We later counted 119 bullet holes, 24 alone in the engine. 2 of the exhaust chambers had been hit, and 16 of the rotary blades were missing. All of the blades from the heating unit were burnt out. The second fuel tank had exploded. The first fuel tank had been hit. The brake discs were burnt through. The hydro tank had been pierced by bullets. The hydro system had failed. But all the same, the plane completed its mission, made a successful landing, and 16 days later took off again.
As soon as the West encountered the MiG in the skies over Korea, the Americans rushed their swept-wing fighter, the Sabre F-86, into battle. It was a more complicated design and was not fully prepared for combat. It had been developed to patrol and defend American skies. But when put to the test, pilots found its capabilities as a jet fighter awe-inspiring.
Due to the requirement of the new speeds, new high speeds, and bringing on new forces that would work against the frame of the airplane and the pilot, it had to be built with heavier materials, structurally sounder, because we had to meet a 600-mile requirement for the Air Force to buy it. And we exceeded that. Instead of 600 miles, we got 671 miles clocked on the register.
The Sabre's engine that achieved these speeds was also based on a British design, but it was different. The Sabre had an axial flow engine instead of the MiG's centrifugal compressor. Like the MiG, air is sucked into the compressor through the front intake. But in the Sabre's engine, the air is passed through a number of rotating and static blades. These progressively compress the air before it's directed into the combustion chambers to be injected, ignited, and burnt to produce the necessary thrust.
We went with the axial flow because it gave the 86 slimmer profile, which was good for the airspeed and the flight pattern.
In speed, the Sabre and the MiG were practically equal. Both could fly at over 600 miles per hour. To reach these speeds, both planes took on a new design, the swept wing. Early planes had straight wings, but at high speed, straight wings built up pressure in front of the wing, creating drag. To prevent this, engineers swept back the wing by 35 degrees. It delayed the drag as the wing cuts through the air. In 1950, the Sabre and the MiG were the fastest planes in the world. But the Sabre's swept wing was more advanced than the MiG's. Swept-wing planes were less controllable at low speed, so U.S. engineers introduced the leading-edge slats that increased the wing area when needed. The Sabre was made stronger by attaching the wings to the base of the plane, not to the sides like the MiG. Because of these extra features, the Sabre was stronger and more agile than the MiG. It even broke the sound barrier, which the MiG never achieved. The Sabre was heavy and strong. The MiG was small and light. Being light gave the MiG greater acceleration. It was quicker off the mark. It also had another benefit. It could climb up to altitudes more quickly than the Sabre.
The MiG had the capability of what would be called lift-over drag. It was lighter with an engine that was just as powerful. And as a result, it could go higher and get there faster.
Due to its powerful engine and low mass, its vertical maneuvers were excellent. No Sabre could be favorably compared to it. It was able to easily move away from the Sabre on the vertical and catch up with it. It could do anything required of it.
The MiG could fly to 50,000 feet. Flying higher than your opponent gave you a tactical advantage. You could choose when to fight and also keep safe from enemy fire.
Once they get up to a high altitude, such as 50,000 feet, it's of course safe. But the purpose of dogfight is you have to find the enemy planes and shoot them down. And you look down there, you have to approach very carefully.
They could pick their time of attack. They could pick their altitude above us at a time of attack, so that they could always be on top of us when they started a dogfight. That means they always had a superior airspeed coming down at us.
The moment the F-86 were flying around it carelessly, that's the moment they can chase down and shoot.
The bigger and heavier Sabre F-86 couldn't reach such a high altitude.
At 40,000 feet with the early F-86As, generally you just ran out of ability to maneuver quickly. Any quick maneuver and it would cause a stall and you'd lose altitude. So we operated mainly between 25 and 30,000 feet as the best fighting altitude for the F-86A model.
Flying at high altitudes may have given the MiG certain advantages, but it also created problems. High up, the plane struggled to keep going.
Plane is barely flying because of the thin air. And that air is very low, so plane has to fly with a high angle, and then you have to control the surface very gently. Otherwise, the plane get into the stalling stall. Once plane go into stalling stall, you cannot get out until you go down to lower altitude. That's the danger is. When you start spinning, then the American planes notice, and they go around waiting for plane to come out of a stalling. And that's the time they approach, they shoot at.
Although the Sabre could catch the MiG as it came out of a stall at low altitude, the MiG could fly higher and seemed to be in control of the battle, choosing when and where to engage the enemy. But the real test was the face-to-face combat of a dogfight. Here the Sabre would show its true power. When the MiG and Sabre came head-to-head over Korea, they were the most evenly matched fighters in the history of aerial combat. To gain the advantage, each pilot had to push their plane to extremes.
Before we went into the combat missions, they told us that the MiG is the best plane in the world. So we thought that no plane can be better than that plane, and that was mistaken.
The Sabre's agility was a product of American high-tech design. For their new jet fighter, they installed state-of-the-art hydraulic systems and a complex tail design. They enabled the Sabre to perform maneuvers that the MiG could not match. This gave the Sabre the upper hand in the dogfight. The Sabre's advantages did not stop here. One of the biggest problems for the pilots of these super-fast planes was G-force. G-force forces the blood in your body away from your head, causing blackouts. American Sabre pilots wore G-suits to combat the problem. The suit inflates around the legs and lower body and pushes the blood back up to the brain. Amazingly, it works, but MiG pilots did not have the G-suits. They just had to deal with the blackouts while they made their maneuvers.
Of course, we had great problems because without a gravitational suit, no man can endure forces of 8 to 12. You'd have to be a Superman.
MiG was strictly manual cable control systems, so you cannot pull too much to pull the stick and put the high G on.
Some of the times I pulled G's with those MiGs, and I wondered how they kept from blacking out.
The design of the MiG's cockpit did not help matters either. Now, 50 years after the war, veteran Sabre pilot Bruce Hinton is going to evaluate his opponent's cockpit.
I would say the distance fore and aft between the pilot and the instrument panel is pretty tight compared to the F-86. I would prefer to have it a little further back to get a better scan. Although the windscreen is about the same location. It's got this metal panel around here which blocks a lot of the view, and I wouldn't like that. In combat, I was constantly turning to look straight over my tail to see if anyone might possibly be there on both sides. In this airplane, I can see back at an angle, but I can't see back over my tail, and I think that visibility is a bad factor. That's Russian design. I don't go for it that much.
Now it's the turn of veteran MiG pilot Ken Rowe to sit in the cockpit of the Sabre. For the first time, he realizes what he was missing.
Looks like I'm sitting on the top of the rock, and I don't see any obstructions, so I can't really see what's going on in front of the plane. This cockpit is way in front of the wings, so I can also look down, left and right, and I can look at the back of me. I can see clearly back of the tail area, and I can see any planes behind me. So it's a very well designed plane.
The Sabre may have had better visibility, but in aerial combat, the contest was all about firepower. Once the battle had engaged and the plane was in your sights, the MiG had a pretty good advantage. With a set of 3 cannons firing high explosive rounds, the MiG was a formidable enemy. But there was a problem. The MiG's cannons were very slow firing, and they only carried 380 rounds. The Sabre, in contrast, had 6 machine guns firing 1,600 rounds per minute. But the MiG was so durable that it could take all the ammunition from the Sabre and still fly away.
The problem is flying at the heights that they were flying. If you punch a lot of holes in the airplane, there's not enough air up there to burn. So one of the problems the Sabres had was getting the MiG to burn. The gun itself fires at a rate of 450 rounds a minute, and they had enough ammunition on board for about 15 seconds worth of squeezing the trigger.
When I did get on this MiG and start hitting him, I hit him hard in the engine, and I saw a bunch of stuff fly out of the engine. I don't know what it was. I figured I had him, but he kept flying, and there was no fire. He didn't blow up as in World War II. When you hit an airplane, the fuel caused it to blow up right away. Jet fuel doesn't do that. So I continued to fire at him and watched him go down. But I used up a tremendous amount of ammunition on that airplane to make it go down, and even then it didn't burn.
The MiG used different weapons. Instead of guns, they had cannons.
The MiG had a 23-millimeter cannon, and this being the 50 caliber round, this is a 20-millimeter round, but it gives you some idea of the size of a round that would have been fired by the MiG. It's huge. It's also a high explosive round. Additionally, the MiG had a 37-millimeter gun on it. Now, this happens to be a 30-millimeter round, but again, you get the idea of just exactly how big this round is. Again, this is a very high explosive round. The big advantage you had with the Sabre was the trajectory for both these weapons was really very high. So you had to get in fairly close, but if you got a hit, it was a devastating hit. It blew the F-86 apart.
Powerful guns were an advantage, but only if you could hit the target. Compared to the MiG, the heavy-bodied Sabre was a more stable gun platform, and it had something the MiG didn't: state-of-the-art radar gun sights. When locked onto the target, the Sabre's gun was more accurate, and the pilot could begin shooting from much further away. This put the Sabre at an advantage. The MiG was simply outgunned.
A MiG's gun sight is not as accurate as the F-86. The range seems like cannon shells are not going far enough. So only time effective is within a short distance, such as 100 meters, which is roughly 300 feet. Beyond that distance, it's not accurate.
The Korean War pitted the Sabre and the MiG head-to-head constantly. Though similar in design, each one had their own advantages. The MiG was light and loaded with heavy guns. The Sabre was agile and had G-suits to give their pilots the advantage in complex maneuvers. But ultimately, it was up to the pilot's skill and knowledge to win the battle. Sabre pilots had that advantage. They were veterans of the Second World War, aggressive and cunning. The Korean pilots, on the other hand, were inexperienced. Most had been flying for less than a year, and it was just not enough.
We were never taught to fly at the extreme capabilities, such as the highest altitude the plane can go up, the highest speed the plane can fly. We learned how to fly the plane at the extreme capabilities after entering the war. And we've never fired cannons before we entered the war.
Throughout the war, the Sabres were always outnumbered by about 10 to 1. But its high-tech equipment and greater number of experienced pilots gave it the edge. By the end of the war, the American Sabre had shot down at least 792 MiGs, but the MiGs had downed less than 80 Sabres. In this conflict, the Sabre beat the MiG. The Sabre's success allowed the U.S. troops to continue the ground war until a ceasefire was signed in 1953.
If someone is going to put me in an aircraft during the Korean War, I want to be in an F-86 Sabre, only because, well, I'm an American.
I would prefer the F-86 at any time.
It was actually one of the best airplanes I've ever flown in my life.
But revolutions in air combat were not the only advancements of the Cold War era. The weapons of the infantry soldiers were changing too. 10 years after the Korean War, the Vietnam War would change the face of ground warfare forever. The Korean War left the U.S. extremely sensitive about communist expansion in Asia. And in the mid-1960s, in a little-known corner of Southeast Asia, their new infantry superweapon, the space-aged M16, ended up battling its most deadly adversary, Russia's legendary AK-47, weapon of choice of the North Vietnamese. Both sides felt they had the winning ideology, and the technology of the weapons was a simple reflection of their global ambitions. The prize, in other words, was the world. Both sides already had accurate and reliable infantry rifles that had done great service in World War II. The bad news was they could only fire one bullet at a time. To fill the air with lead, the submachine gun was the weapon of choice. But unlike the rifle, hitting a target beyond 50 yards was more luck than judgment. The assault rifle, half machine gun and half rifle, was designed to do the job of both. The Soviet and American assault rifles were very different designs. As a test of whether communist or capitalist technology was better, Vietnamese combat conditions were ideal.
You were not able to see your enemy. You were in a jungle environment where all you were seeing was muzzle flashes or maybe some smoke. You didn't have a clearly defined target, so you would have an area target which you would spray with ammunition to keep your enemy's head down. Basically, it's whoever lays down a heavier volume of fires who's going to win.
It's firepower that counts. And with an assault weapon, you've got firepower.
Firepower could keep you alive, and soldiers developed very close relationships with their guns.
As an Army infantryman, this is sort of like an extension of my arm. It was always close to me. I would never go anywhere or think about going anywhere without reaching for my weapon. Wherever you go, on a chow line, to the latrine, it's always there. It sleeps next to you. And I always assumed that when I was frightened, it was frightened too, but it gave a certain amount of comfort that I wasn't alone. I mean, that may be crazy, but that's how I felt.
Even the construction of the AK-47 and M16 revealed deep differences between East and West. In 1990, 7 years before his death, M16 designer Eugene Stoner gave a rare interview with AK-47 designer Mikhail Kalashnikov. In it, he recalls how U.S. demands for a super-light weapon forced him to make radical advances in the M16's construction.
That meant choosing lightweight materials right from the beginning. Aluminum in place of steel, fiberglass and construction in place of wood.
This is really space-age stuff. It's made out of plastic. It's made out of composite material, early composites. The buffer that's in here is a composite. So this is sort of space-age.
In the 1960s, the M16 looked like a kid's toy.
We had nicknamed this thing the Matty Mattel, made by a toy gun manufacturer. I mean, when it first came out, that's what it looked like. It looked like something that a kid would play with, and it was, no wood. And this, we thought, oh, it's still cheap plastic, this kind of thing. So for us initially, that was the joke. That was our toy gun.
The Kalashnikov is a far more traditional gun.
The AK-47 is of rather conventional design, using common materials, steel and wood, and readily available machining technology. The parts are manufactured to less precision. From an engineering standpoint, it is a low-tech weapon.
This means that for automatic fire, the M16 is much easier to control than the AK-47. Slowed down 14,000 times, it's clear that the kick or recoil of the high-precision M16 moves it very little. Not the AK-47. It's throwing itself around. Look at the end of the barrel. It's clearly flexing up and down. One reason for this wobbly performance is the way it works.
What's happening when this is fired is, of course, the cycle rate's fairly high, and you've got a really big hunk of metal coming back, and it's slightly off-center. Not much, but slightly off-center. So this thing's coming back and then coming back forward, So you've got really two violent acts going on, and then if you have the round going off, you have a third violent act going on. The M16, on the other hand, this is a much smoother operating weapon. Consequently, the accuracy on this in full automatic fire is a lot better than is the AK.
We were told by the armor that this weapon had so little recoil that you could fire it full automatic from your forehead. I set that selector on full automatic and I put my rifle against my forehead, just like this. And what I wasn't aware of was where I was aiming my rifle at the time in this position, and it turned out when I pulled back on the trigger, it did go full automatic. The rounds went down about 10 feet in front of me. Everybody ran for cover, and I did find out it was a little bit more recoil than he initially told us it was. I had quite a headache for about half a day, but I had to prove it one way or the other.
If he tried that with an AK, it could have killed him. An easy round one to the M16, a higher precision weapon, and far easier to handle as a machine gun. Can the AK-47 claw ground back with its performance as a rifle, rated by accuracy, not controllability? We've come to Morris County, New Jersey. The Picatinny Arsenal is where the U.S. Army puts their small arms to the test. We've set up targets at about 200 yards. It's an easy distance for a decent rifle. First up is the M16. What we're looking for is grouping, how close the shots are to each other. Every shot strikes close to the heart, in the kill zone. Now, the AK-47. Only one of the 5 shots even tags the lower left edge of the paper. Not one strikes the kill zone. And it's clear from the design of the sights that the American weapon was designed to be more accurate from the very start.
The sights are very good. You have a little peep sight here in the back, okay, which you can use for short range. And what you could do is you can actually flip it forward, and if you look on the back, you can actually see an L. That's for long distance. In the front, you have just a post with what we call bunny ears, which flare out. And what you do is you center your post in the center of your rear sight, and you put it right on target, and you fire, and you should hit target.
The AK sight is very crude.
It's not as good as the peep sights that the Americans have been using since World War II. You take your front post and you line it up with the little notch right here, and the top of the front post and the top of this bar will be level. And you set your target right on top of those 3 points. This weapon really isn't meant to shoot out 400 meters. You've got to have really good ammunition, a good barrel, nice steady hand, a good eye, and no wind conditions to shoot out any distance like that. If you do hit somebody at that distance, it'll hurt, but you're not necessarily going to be able to do it every time.
Out in open terrain, that extra accuracy could give the M16 a decisive advantage. Round 2 to the M16, an easier machine gun, a more accurate rifle. The much-liked World War II rifle ammunition seemed an obvious choice for America's first lightweight assault rifle, but the powerful recoil of the old ammunition made their new featherweight M14 dangerously uncontrollable as a machine gun.
Target.
This is so light, you cannot control it. So the first round, if you were to fire this fully automatically, the first round would be there, the second round would be there, third round would be there. And anything after that, it's an anti-aircraft gun.
To make a handheld automatic weapon, the designers would need ammunition with less recoil or kick. The gun's success would stand or fall on the design of the bullet. The Soviet solution was brutally simple. Take the heavy old rifle bullet and make it shorter, and therefore lighter. The M16 uses a smaller, slimmer bullet. With far less recoil than the AK, the M16 gun can weigh barely 2/3 as much as the AK-47, which was exactly what the U.S. military wanted, as Eugene Stoner explained to AK-47 designer Mikhail Kalashnikov.
Basically, they wanted the lightest weight system that they could get. They wanted a weapon that would weigh 6 pounds, loaded with 20 rounds of ammunition. The weight was the driving emphasis on the whole design. In other words, there are a lot of things maybe you would like to do, but couldn't do because of the weight restraints.
The Army people are the same everywhere. They want you to come up with weightless weapons, but there is a limit to everything.
Yeah, they like to defy the laws of physics.
The tiny bullet that Stoner came up with to save weight gives the M16 extra accuracy because it travels faster. Faster bullets are more accurate. In addition, this little round weighs half as much as a Kalashnikov's lump of lead, which gives the M16 another combat advantage: lightweight.
Lighter's always better. I mean, it is. Yeah, that's the bottom line, especially if you're the guy that has to carry it. The M16 round at 5.56 is a lighter, smaller round compared to the 7.62 that's used in the AK-47. What that means, really, is the capability to carry more rounds, which is what you need when you have an automatic weapon system, you know, because you go through rounds fairly quickly.
I carried as much ammo as I could physically carry and run. Any place on my body, there was ammo. Ammo in my flak jacket, ammo in my pants, ammo in my ammo belt, any place. My greatest fear is that I would run out of ammo, and I was not going to let that happen.
To compete, AK-47 soldiers had to sacrifice everything, even food.
In a real combat situation, a soldier must not take an additional can of sardines, but an extra cartridge.
That gives the American M16 a powerful lead over the Soviet AK-47, with technical superiority in 3 key areas: range, accuracy, and weight. But real combat is a different world. On the battlefields of Vietnam, the AK-47's strengths began to tell. In the close combat conditions of Vietnam, where the Soviet AK-47 in the hands of the North Vietnamese met the American M16 assault rifle, the M16's biggest advantage, better range, wasn't much use.
The reality is a basic soldier with iron sights can't shoot that far when he's shooting at an opponent that knows he's being shot at and is trying to do everything he can not to be shot. So, you know, most engagements really are 300 meters on in.
In fact, the long-range accuracy of the M16 hadn't evolved from the requirements of modern combat at all, but from American traditions rooted firmly in the past.
There was a myth that grew up about the American rifle. It won the revolution. Well, it didn't, but nonetheless, there's a myth. And throughout American history, it's this one-shot, one-kill mentality that has been a very big part in American military history.
To neutralize the M16's range advantage, the North Vietnamese chose close combat techniques.
Their standard tactic was to do what they called hold on to our belt buckle. They would try to get as close to us as they possibly could and achieve fire superiority on us so that we couldn't use the weapons that we had. They were real good at it. They were real good.
My father fought in Vietnam, and he told me stories of being so close to his opponent that, in fact, they crossed rifles. So, you know, the fight became very close.
In close quarters battles, the M16's better accuracy could not guarantee victory. Though less accurate, the AK-47 had the advantage of a simple, easy-to-maintain construction. Like much of the equipment used by Russia and Vietnam, it was brutally low-tech. The M16's first-half superiority's been checked by the AK-47's remarkable advantage of simplicity. And if the battles deteriorated into hand-to-hand combat, the AK also had an advantage in its heavy wood and iron construction.
Machine guns made from those materials can also be used for hand-to-hand combat. You can really smack someone with it. Whereas with the M16, its butt and barrel were made from fiberglass. If you hit someone hard with it, it would break. So it is used more for shooting. Hand fighting is feasible only with a Kalashnikov.
Another round to the AK-47, and the M16's troubles weren't over yet because the gun had been sent to Vietnam with ammunition it wasn't designed for. The explosive propellant that drives the bullet out of the gun had been changed to a dirty type that gummed up the works. The M16 was jamming in combat.
When it deployed, the powder mixture was changed. It was changed to a mixture called ball powder. It's the stuff the United States Army has used forever. It works. It also fouls. Because of the powder fouling, you had failure to fire, and you were in a lot of trouble.
If the gun failed, cleaning this dirty fouling out was the only answer. But soldiers had been told that the gun was so sophisticated, it didn't need cleaning at all, to the anger of designer Eugene Stoner.
The Army didn't furnish any training manuals. They didn't even have a bore brush or cleaning rod for these weapons, and they issued 85,000 of them.
A gun that needs cleaning in combat could cost soldiers their lives. The military had to find a way to make sure soldiers cleaned their weapons. Their solution was an unusual training manual.
This has Connie Rod. Connie is a buxom young lady. And, well, most 19-year-olds, I can remember when I was 19, and it certainly caught my attention, and I like to read about Connie Rod, and it's sort of comic bookish. Shoot, people read a comic book. They won't read a field manual. Field manuals, let's face it, they're dull.
Because of the closely fitting parts, weapons cleaning would have to be as second nature as breathing to keep the M16 in working order.
You cleaned your weapon before you did anything else. You cleaned your weapon before you ate. You cleaned your weapon before you cleaned your socks. Oh, by the way, you have to make Marines change their socks by the numbers. So consequently, you also have to make Marines clean their weapon by the numbers, too.
You have a limited amount of time. You dedicate that time to get it clean. You don't want no distractions, and hopefully you had some place that you could put it that it was relatively clean, even though you may not have had a shower in weeks.
No comic books were necessary for the low-tech AK-47. Clean or not, it would always fire.
If it is not cleaned properly, it will not shoot so well, but it will shoot.
The tolerances in that weapon are so sloppy. You still have to clean it, but it's not as vital.
Soldiers had to come up with some very low-tech solutions to protect their high-tech M16s from the dirt, sand, and water they faced in the hostile Vietnamese environment. But no matter how careful they were, it was far easier to make an M16 jam than an AK-47. The close fit between the M16 assault rifle's parts meant that any dirt or debris that got near the gun would be trouble.
We were in Chu Lai area, and I was digging a hole in the sand. Next thing, a tree line opens up on us, and everyone's firing back, and I lunged for my rifle, and when I did, it was somewhat laying like this, enough that I knew it was out of the sand, but when I grabbed it, I covered it with the sand. And as soon as I raised it to my shoulder and I pulled the trigger, all I heard was a click. I'm already panicking at this point. I mean, I'm a Lance Corporal. This is my first real firefight, and the round didn't go off.
Sand was no hazard to the AK-47. In fact, it had been part of its original Army trials.
I can give you an example of these types of trials. At the very last stage, the prototypes were hung up by ropes and dragged along sand. And after that, without any sort of cleaning, they were fired.
In an environment like Vietnam, debris jamming the close-fitting parts of the M16 meant it could never match the loosely built AK-47's stunning reliability.
I can suggest you pour cement into it or drive over it with a tank. That will break it.
Reliability had been the goal of the gun's designer Mikhail Kalashnikov from the outset.
My credo was then, and has remained throughout my career, simple and dependable.
Simplicity and fantastic reliability, two more advantages of the AK-47 over the M16. The AK-47's heavier bullet may be slower and less accurate, but its sheer power is indisputable. We've set up these cinder blocks to simulate the wall of a building in a combat zone. First, the M16. Quite impressive. And now, the AK-47. We've also simulated a jungle environment with this 8-inch block of dense pine. At 28 yards, the M16 bullet fails to penetrate. And the AK-47? This extra punch is no test range trick. Out in the dense jungle in close quarters ambushes, it could be fatal. And it brings the AK-47 right back into contention. Which leaves the M16 and the AK-47 level pegging, playing different strengths and weaknesses against each other. Assault rifles can be better as rifles or as machine guns. They'll always be a design trade-off. The M16 is closer to a rifle, the AK-47 a machine gun. And you can see it clearly in the fire selector switch.
The AK-47, when you start in the upper position, you're in the safe position. It also works as a dust cover. You drop down one notch, you're on fully automatic. Next notch is semi-automatic. This is primarily a machine gun. It's to be used on fully automatic. Where with an M16, your selector lever goes to the safe position, to the semi position, to the automatic position. The M16 was designed as a rifle with a fully automatic capability.
Making the M16 something of a surgical tool, the AK-47 a blunt stick. The Cold War that produced these two assault rifles may be over, but wars, as well as the war between these rifles themselves, rage on. The M16 is a precision instrument for the well-trained soldier, still used by professional armies across the globe. The rudimentary AK-47 in the hands of poor or untrained soldiers continues to demonstrate its effectiveness in worldwide battle, contrary to the wisdom that high technology rules. Regardless, the performance of the weapon will always depend on the war being fought and on the skills of those who are fighting it.